Hi there, and welcome back to our continuing video series, ESG, Acronym to Action. You know, environmental action is a very critical part of our evolving corporations and organizations. It's becoming, as we know, a huge thing. And we're going to talk a lot about the different factors involved in environmental action. But, you know, one of the issues, and I've written this before, is that change is hard. And that's especially when the change isn't gradual, but it's immediate. And the consequences of not addressing environmental issues, they're not something that we can pass on now, or we can wait for nature to take its course. These ways that we used to do things, they just don't work anymore because communities, government, and our shareholders and stakeholders, well, they want answers now in terms of what action we're going to take with regard to the environment. And we hear about climate change all the time now in the media. Obviously, there's differing views on this, but it's really, quite frankly, irrefutable that our climate is changing, our world is changing, and we need to develop a response to that. And so it's hard, I get that, and change is hard because, like I say, it's not something we can just put off anymore. We need to respond immediately to the changes that we're seeing in terms of the environment. Okay, so what about environmental action? What does that mean? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to break things down here, because what's truly important about the environment is that we must begin to act locally. We need to think globally because our actions do impact the planet. They do. We can often say, well, what does our little recycling program here do? Or what does this do over there? Or is this really, does it have any benefit? 100% it does have benefit. We look at initiatives now in different municipalities for things like composting, community gardens, and recycling programs. That's a real important step forward for a lot of communities, and they're realizing that, change needs to occur. And so often, I think that what happens is we get bogged down a lot of times in the rhetoric and us versus them in terms of how we think about climate and we think about the environment, and we lose sight of the tangible things that we can just be doing every day that actually make a lot of sense. And that's something that we need to really draw attention to, is often these initiatives are sort of less about making this global impact, and it's more about impacting our community. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about that in this video series. It's all about community. When it all boils down to it, ESG truly is about community. So we're going to talk about a 30-day plan. Wow, often, and I'm sure you've heard about it, we have these climate conferences, which are great, and the world leaders get together and they set the 30-year target or the 20-year target. And then we, sooner or later, the 20 years hits and we go, oh, did we make the target? Oh, we missed it. So maybe we should just back out of this. Maybe we should just forget about it. Absolutely not. We need to have these long-term goals and strategies, but we must begin to take, like I say, these tangible daily things that we can do to help our environment and make things different. So I've said there's a practical guide to 30 days of sustainable reprogramming. That's what I've called it. Now, obviously, programming somebody can have some negative connotations, but it definitely doesn't here. We need to reprogram the way that we think about sustainability and the environment and what that means. And again, we've seen in the first video about the numbers, the bottom line. That's pretty critical when you look at how that impacts companies and organizations. And we also need to be thinking about reprogramming our operational mindset. So I've got an example there, the 1 tree per person. We'll talk a little bit about that more. Now, another critical component about the environment is how we respond to, I call it the transitional energy strategy. This is a really critical component of thinking about the environment. We need to be able to utilize renewables as part of a redundant backup program or non-critical systems power source. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but transitional environmental energy strategy is absolutely fundamental if we're going to have long-term impact. And again, it's thinking about now and moving towards something bigger. We hear the big automakers now are starting to take this into account. They're not building diesel-powered trucks, for instance, at Volvo anymore. GM has announced they're going to go to an all-electric fleet. And sure, they've put some targets and some dates, and we hope that that's the case and that these things work out. But more importantly, they're taking the steps because they realize that this is becoming a critical part of our move forward in terms of the environment and our response to it. But if we're powering our cars with electricity from coal, this is a problem because we're really not resolving the issue. So we'll talk about transitional energy strategy in greater detail. You know, if something can be used for energy too, instead of putting it back into the landfill, that's important. In our world now, we're looking at reuse opportunities. How we turn necessarily something that's negative, some junk and garbage, and how can we turn that into something that's positive? And there's ways to do that. Those are tangible things that we can do now. And they will help us, obviously, as we move towards these long-term goals and targets. But in the meantime, we can be doing positive things. And like I say, energy or waste byproducts, well, they can be part of what's called the industrial ecosystem. And we're going to talk about that further too, as we begin to sort of unpackage environmental action. Okay, so let's talk about environmental action in terms of, like I say, the 30-day plan, a practical guide to 30 days of sustainable reprogramming. Now, obviously, we want to make sure it lasts longer than 30 days. That's helpful, but won't be long-term helpful. But again, we often think about environmental action as something very lofty, and that's good, right? It is. Absolutely, we have to dream big, as they say, okay? But the 30-year targets and the 30-month operational plans, well, all these are important. We're not thinking in terms of 30 days. What can I do now? What can I do as a member of the team at my organization to create change? But more importantly, create change with intention, right? And we understand that intention is something that's fairly immediate, and I think that's part of it too, isn't it? You know, if we have the intention to go and do something, then we go and react to it, and we do it, instead of thinking about it in a long-term sort of lofty thing. It's admirable, obviously, these big goals, but often they're not attainable. And you know what? Attainable goals are not actionable. And that's the key message as we begin to look at developing an ESG strategy. It has to be something that's actionable. And the practical goals then offer an action with the environmental intent. And that's really important, isn't it? It's important that we take the goals that we have, create the action using the intent to create change. And this is where we can truly make a difference. Okay, well, I've developed a few sort of practical ways to take a look at how to do this, and there are going to be many more, and we would invite you to let us know some of your ideas. You can certainly contact us at a Power Start group. We'd love to hear from you, maybe some of your ideas as to what you can do immediately. But I've called this the triple P. Now, we hear about this a lot. It's a common term. It's used in the public-private partnership to get stuff done. Whether it does or it doesn't often remains to be seen, but I've called it the public planting partnership. So imagine if we took a look at looking at the environmentally appropriate planting. Now, this is really important. Many people don't realize it because you often plant a pine tree, certainly in this part of the world, in northern areas, we plant pine trees and we think that that's good. And sure, the pine trees grow and there they are, but pine trees actually take an enormous amount of water. And so what we find is often when you look around the base of an evergreen tree, there's often nothing growing there because it's sucking all the water and the nutrients out of the soil. So that's starting to get down into specifics, but it's important that we don't just go again with a great, lofty, wonderful goal and we don't think about the details. But let's say now we're going to do an environmentally appropriate planting for every person in our scope of operations. Now, I'd like to see this actually built out into communities. So if you have 5,000 people living in your little village, well, you're going to plant 5,000 trees. But let's start at something more manageable with our organization. There's 200 of us working there, let's say. Well, you're going to go out and you're going to do some environmentally appropriate planting, and it's going to mean low water, low maintenance, and you're going to do that for 200 people that work at your office. Can you imagine what a difference that would make? How incredible that would be. And if that's one company, and then another company, and another service group, and another nonprofit organization, everybody's working together to plant, we already know that, you know, the most oxygen is created on Earth by plankton, ironically in the oceans, but the second way is by plants. And so obviously the more trees we're planting and the more gardens, community gardens, growing garden centers, these are all important ways that we can add to our environmental footprint, which is a positive one instead of a negative one. So this is just one example that I've created, the Public Planting Partnership, but I want you to think for a minute. If your company had 50 people and you go plant 50 trees, what an impact that would have. Because often, again, what happens is we hear about the big lofty goals, we think it's too much, so then we decide that we're going to do something at the local level, but the doubt starts to creep in sometimes, doesn't it? Well, if I plant 50 trees, does that really make a difference? Or is that going to impact the world or make any sort of change? Well, what if 10 companies had 50 people and planted 50 trees? Now we have 500 trees, right? And I can tell you 500 trees makes a difference. It does. There will be impact on the environment if we plant 500 trees. And so I've put down here that often, I don't know, here in Calgary at least, you can go to the big stores and they'll have the trees on sale and the shrubs and whatever. And at the end of the season, there's some that are losing a few leaves and they don't look quite as good as they did before. I can tell you that those trees and plants will come back, no problem, with some love and care. And I think back to Charlie Brown, right? Remember his little bent over tree? And then they all got together finally at the end and they had the beautiful Christmas tree. But in this case, we need to be working with our local growers and garden centers. And imagine if companies began to establish those relationships and said, no, we have 50 people here and you got some trees that nobody seems to want. And so at the end of the day, let's take those and let's try and do something with those. You know, they're going to get probably thrown out or taken to the landfill or whatever. Imagine if we were able to do something with that. And now you've created a relationship between your corporation, your organization, and your community with the growers. And then furthering that, you can now talk about really making change with intention about the environment. And it's something that's very tangible. And that falls into our, quote, 30-day sustainable reprogramming. Now, I've seen some examples of this, and this isn't necessarily my example, but I wanted to set it out here as another practical way of doing something sustainable. And I've called it the parquet program. Okay? So it doesn't have anything to do with parking lots, except building more of them. That's what I'm trying to say. We certainly don't need to do any more of that. But what we could do is convert a parking lot or a space within the parking lot to a park, and then help to beautify the local park space by collaborating again with your community. I walk into our co-work office here and I walk past one of the health facilities in our city, and I've noticed on a pretty regular basis that there's an enormous amount of land there that was, I guess, dedicated to parking because city planners do like to build a lot of parking lots for cars that may or may not exist there. But in this case, I think it's pretty safe to say, because I've been there several times, it's not the cars parking in that parking lot for the space that's there. Well, what if we did this? What if we converted part of that space into a park area? What if we put some plantings in there and put some picnic tables in there and put some areas for people to sit and just reflect? Because it is a health facility, so obviously sometimes there's some negative things happening there, obviously. And if people had a place where they could just be quiet, where they could reflect, and they could feel like they're part of something instead of just being in a big empty parking lot, well, it's an opportunity to do that. And I've seen it done in other places before. Often there's been pictures of old schoolyards or things that have been abandoned, and the neighborhood comes and takes it over and plants some things. So again, I haven't necessarily invented this, obviously, but I do want to draw attention to it because it's not a big 30-year plan thing. This is something that could be done fairly immediately. And so when you create a green space where something was empty and wasted and hard space, as we call it, okay, then we're utilizing that existing space, filling it with environmentally appropriate planning. What an opportunity that we've created. And, there's various things you can do with that. You've created perhaps a recreational space, for sure, an environmental space, maybe a spiritual space for employees and community. Like I say, a place for people to be able to reflect, a place for people to just sit and be quiet. In our day-to-day lives that are so bombarded with the social media and all these things that are coming at us all the time, what an opportunity to be able to reflect. And so I say, let's take a look for these big open parking lots where nobody's parking anyway, and let's do something positive for our communities. And the final sort of immediate example, and like I say, these are 3 examples that I've created and have written about in the book, but basically you can think of some other ones, I'm sure. But I call it the factory plus food space. And that is the concept of converting or committing industrial space to seasonal planter boxes, okay, and/or garden plots, and they may have greenhouse potential. And I'm going to discuss greenhouse potential in a lot more detail in terms of energy, but let's just talk about it in light of this. If you have a factory or an industrial space that's not being used, imagine if you were able to convert that into a place where food could be grown. You can partner with the food bank, or you can partner with various organizations in the city or town where you live and turn that sort of, and I hate to say this, but it's kind of useless space, for whatever reason it was created initially, it's now useless and not being used. And so if we were able to take that space and convert that to a place where, again, food could be grown, even in planter boxes. I understand that there are some spaces where you could plow the field. They're doing that in Toronto, actually. There's a big initiative right now to turn a lot of useless sort of old industrial warehouse factory space. The buildings have been knocked down, weeds have grown for years. They're turning that into area that's being cultivated by some of the local food banks and groups that can benefit from that, and they're planting crops in there. Imagine, the middle of the city, they're planting crops, not just a few flowers, but actual crops to help benefit the community. That's a huge, huge opportunity for us, and it's something that can be done fairly easily. So I've said, okay, we have this useless space, hard space, places where things are being wasted. Well, what if we did this and helped to grow food for our community? But also, there's nothing wrong with growing food for the company either. Imagine if you had a plot of land where the company was working together in a collaborative way to grow some stuff for the people who work there. We all should be. I need to eat more fruit and vegetables than I do, but we all should be taking a look at that in terms of our overall health. Imagine if your team was working together as a team to spend some time taking care of the garden. It's been proven fact that kind of thing, gardening, relaxation, hiking, going out into the wilderness, going out into nature, all of these things have been proven over and over again to be a huge benefit to us mentally in terms of our mental health and also physically. So there's an idea what a team building exercise that would be. Turn your old, useless, dead space into a place where your team can work together to create food for themselves, but also for the community. And to me, that's a way of creating a collaborative and interactive space where people feel involved. Okay, we go back to the corporate DNA that we discussed before. If that's being implanted on our corporate DNA, then the team is involved in seeing that be part of the ongoing process. And you can now look at that and say, hey, we actually did something really positive for the environment. We took an actionable item and made it real. And we don't just talk about it, but we fulfilled the opportunity to create real change, like we said, with intention. So that's my first section in the video about the 30-day plan, a practical guide to 30 days of sustainable reprogramming. I'm Chris Tesarski, and I look forward to bringing you our next part of environmental action, and we're going to talk in greater detail about transitional energies. I really look forward to seeing you in the next video.